Welcome back to the Torque Test channel. Founded in 1893 by brothers Edward and John Hurley, John Patrick Hopkins, and Roger Charles Sullivan, the Thor Power Tool Company, then Independent Pneumatic, started making their first tool, a pneumatic power hammer, eventually out of factories in Aurora and offices in Chicago. By 1953, they invoked the popularity of their Thor tools like that hammer and became the Thor Power Tool Company, that next year acquiring Speedway Manufacturing. In between 1954 and 1964, also manufactured, among other things like washing machines and motorcycles, impact wrenches like this here, Model 55, produced by their Speedway division at 1834 South 52nd Avenue in Cicero, Illinois. They would go on to make other models as well and tools up until the early 1980s. But this one, if this classic post-war streamlined Howard Hughes-like aesthetic that looks like it could shoot off into outer space isn't enough to punctuate just how far removed we are from this era, that address, a street now named Laramie, it appears, coming after 51st Avenue on the other side, that a Mr. George Heath assembled and inspected this very tool, is now or at least most recently, a COVID testing parking lot. Not touching that subject with the 10-foot pole, but it really drives home what different worlds Mr. Heath and I must have lived in. So today we're going to test tools like this. Years back, I also bought this here Cleo USA-made air impact from a similar era. Our best guess is early 60s. This was advertised as not working, and a coworker and I got it running, but I've never measured it versus modern air impacts or cordless for that matter. And we're going to go in steps of 30, early 60s-ish to early 90s with air and corded electric impact wrenches from when Vanilla Ice was rolling in his 5.0, and finally jump another 30 years to today with an Air Thor impact wrench, corded impacts, and a cordless electric impact in the form of a Milwaukee, where these days a 5.0 is still a 5.0, but like with overhead cams and direct injection, these tools have gotten some updates compared to the past. So we're going to employ our 10,000 frames per second high-speed camera to reveal what these differences really look like, how these tools work, and maybe that will help to explain some of the power differences that we do see. This is my Cleo WP421C that I bought a few years back. I was told it wasn't functional, but really it just had a massive air leak and was also full throttle all the time. A kind coworker of mine was able to source some old regulator and spring parts and reassemble the trigger and inlet assembly, and that's what we got here, a fully functional 60-some-odd-year-old Cleo impact, which I've been using off and on ever since. Now, if you don't know Cleo, they, along with their Dotco line, maybe also rope in Astro Tools as well, are some of the OG air tool makers in the USA. Basically sort of like Atlas Copco for Europe. If you wanted a $650 die grinder that your great grandkids will enjoy, this is where you'd go. In a day and age where we get 2, 3, 4 years out of a cordless tool battery around here, 1 to 2 years more, and the tool's looking pretty similar to this. I'm not going to debate the pros and cons here, but I think we can all agree at least it's different mentalities when making a tool. Let's throw this and the Thor Model 55 on the dyno to compare the two, then open these up and take a look at their insides before we take some jumps into the future. Here's the corded Thor impact in our 5-second working torque test. A test that was thought up by Astro Tools and Ingersoll Rand not too many years after this was created. What feels super weird on this one is the forward reverse switch is backwards to every other modern impact we've used. So yeah, 78 foot-pounds. I will say it feels like driving a Cadillac. It's pretty comfy as an impact goes, so maybe it's great for a factory setting, assembling a lot of things. But as for lots of torque, well, let's take a look at the Cleo, another half-inch drive impact from a similar era, but pneumatic. 345 foot-pounds. That's a lot. It really is. For some context, let's take a look at an early 90s impact real quick. Our go-to Ingersoll Rand 231H. This is our go-to because it's from an era where if they said max torque was 450 foot-pounds, it made 450 foot-pounds in a max torque test. So it's often used in double-checking calibration here. At the start of this channel, this tool made 285 foot-pounds in a median working torque test. And here with the same recommended 90 psi working pressure, it makes 286 foot-pounds in a median test. This is why we love these things. If you maintain them, they are just dead reliable. So it looks like a 1960s impact dunking on a 1990s impact. We're going to have to open this thing and take a look. I've read that it uses an oil bath instead of grease, which is rare. You can add that right into here into the case, but otherwise have little idea of what's going on in this thing. Not much of that oil left here, but some did later pour out. So this is actually pretty cool. I've never come across this sort of design by accident. I've only seen it when disassembling an actual NASCAR pit stop gun. Follow that link if you want to see that. But this is what a traditional, normal, more modern air impact hammer design looks like. It's called a twin hammer. Sometimes you'll see a single jumbo hammer in its place, but this twin hammer, 2 hammer cams, is very typical of what's found in this 1990s IR and later models today too. The Cleo, on the other hand, is not a single or twin hammer. It's called a rocking dog clutch. The hammer case spins about the drive anvil, and the dogs here cam out of place and hit the anvil wings and then rock back. An advantage of this is often speed, which is maybe why we see this Cleo do so well in a short 5-second test. We'll have to see. But we've never shot how one of these work in high speeds, so pretty excited to get the opportunity to do so on this vintage impact. Next to go under the knife is the 1950s design Thor electric. We of course take these apart after testing, so to any of you familiar with how electric and corded impacts work, this likely looks familiar, but I've had a few dozen open before and never seen anything quite like this.
Whoa. That is fascinating. That's awesome.
First of all, the hammer has an inner cam like we've never seen before. It's sort of wild. We'll take a closer look at how that works. But another thing is these 2 hardened dowel pins sticking out of the hammer mass. This probably simplified machining processes in the 50s and 60s and also provides a very hard, low wear surface to interact with the anvil dogs. And that anvil looking more like a batarang than ever. Each dog on the anvil is curved to match the shape of these dowels, and that all gets driven forward and reset by this hammer spring, which is looking very spindly, not much chunk to it. Here's how an early 1990s corded now Ingersoll Rand, when made in Japan, compares to that 1950s design. $260/98. So while in Air Tools the 1990s didn't see any improvement, we do see that in corded. Let's slow things way down and have a look at it. First thing you'll see when working away is this coil spring we're focusing on here, binding up, driving the hammer forward, then binding up again to repeat the process every 180 degrees. You can even see this tension build and then strain the spring before releasing that potential energy, something we really haven't gotten to see before. Now to the business end, keep in mind this is thousands of hits per minute. The dowel pins hit, then slide up on the anvil dogs before being released to fly on to the next one. This sliding, scraping action, and later what we see with an even higher frame rate, the bouncing here, is not a super efficient transfer of potential energy. Don't get me wrong, this is not exactly new out of the box, and I don't think they had 10,000 frames per second at their disposal in the 1950s to witness this for tuning it, but ideally you'd have a much stiffer, larger, stronger spring that's able to make the hammer hit, then recoil and begin to bounce on to the next impact. But the size of the spring is limited by the speed and grunt of the motor. Let's have a closer look at both of those topics. Behind the hammer assembly, you'll find a planetary gearbox, gear reduction just like in modern cordless impacts, except in this case, just 2 planets instead of 3 or 4, something I've not seen before again. And those are supported in a single shear design, not caged and supported on the top, just posts. Milwaukee's failed Rev B version of their 2767, taking a page out of this one's book a bit. So this is the gear reduction we're working with. Slide this down to 2 planets, and the center sun gear is much smaller than this, just 7 teeth. That looks more like what we're dealing with. And the ring gear on the outside, we counted 64 teeth. So that makes it 28 teeth on the planets, which is correct for what we're seeing. In gear reduction here, it appears to be 4 to negative 0.5, or a 8-to-1 reduction, and that one being in reverse of the power source. 8-to-1's not all that much, but also not bringing a lot of hammer blows with it either. And based on the 1260 RPM anvil, that works out to 10,000 RPM, even from this brushed AC motor, and those brushes are, well, they're sort of micro. Super easy to service, I'll give it that, but very small carbon brushes. This explains the spring size pairing, and that mixed with the mass of the hammer, which, while looking large, the central cam riding on this roller bearing, another thing I've never seen, accounts for a lot of that smooth Cadillac feeling, that bearing, but also burrows out a large hole in the center of your hammer, which is subtracting mass. As a comparison, let's hop into 2024. Corded impacts aren't dropping daily in modern times, but the corded Bauer from Harbor Freight is still for sale and actually one of the top spec corded impacts you can buy these days. So the Thor here and the 1990s Japanese IR will be taking that on in our 15-second best case scenario test you're seeing here, which the vintage Thor is going to be mustering 190 foot-pounds to beat. Here's the corded Bauer and Ingersoll Rand. 610 and 394 over that 190. The Bauer bringing 2,600 RPM and 3,000 impacts per minute, which is a hard horse to chase with less than half of those impacts in the same amount of time. And yeah, it has a larger hammer and more modern AC motor behind it. We'll be adding 2024 cordless into the mix, but first, let's check out that NASCAR style impact mechanism on the Cleo. The air tool hits once every 360 degrees, which imparts more speed and more energy into the anvil, and it's worth keeping in mind when assembled, it behaves more like this, with that bushing held in place, centering the hammer mass assembly, so less all over the place with each hit, but still some heavy hits. You can see the rocking dog design at work here, hitting, then rocking out of the way for the air motor to speed up that hammer mass and spin around again. And even flinging some oil and high speed here in the process, it's pretty cool. Modern twin hammer designs work much in the same way, just two floating hammers that also act as cams and both hit at the same time. Let's compare them instead now on the dyno. Here's the Cleo taking on the early 90s IR and a 2024 Astro Thor with the vintage Thor also on screen. 531 over 517. 517 foot-pounds from a 1960s gun. That's pretty awesome. That's more than the 2024 current offering Makita LXT cordless mid-torque that's still 60 years later larger in most dimensions. The reason NASCAR used these rocking dog designs was speed. They hit early and fast, and as you can see here on the dyno graph, a twin hammer scales better with more inlet pressure, and in our 15-second best case scenario test we use 150 psi static. A gun this old still taking 150 psi, you gotta love it. But yeah, still some gap between the Thor and the air tools down here and modern options, mainly due to hammer mass increases, motor size, and number of motor vanes. The 2024 Thor is using almost twice as many motor vanes. Gotta say, pretty happy with this 517 foot-pounds. Not too long ago, M28 was Milwaukee's latest cordless tech, and that made 378 foot-pounds for us. So it's only somewhat recently, and with brushless motors, that cordless has been able to even surpass 1960s air tool technology and still needs an extra helping of size. The closest Milwaukee nowadays to this Cleo is the M18 mid-torque, and the air tool still beats it there. The next step up in size, however, is Milwaukee's latest high torque, and this is what that looks like. 2024 air and cordless on screen with Cold War era air and electric. Now, some of this has to do with mass. The corded Thor's hammer assembly weighs just 50 to 60% of the Milwaukee's, but most of it is advancements in electric motors being able to easily drive this size of hammer and spring, resetting 2,400 times per minute. Think about it, they have to design this tool to be able to do this even with a small 2 amp hour battery that they carry. Imagine what they could do if they only designed these tools to work with 5 amp hours and above. Like corded tools require 12, 14, 15 amp capable circuits. We're continually shocked at where cordless and even air tech these days have pushed boundaries and records year over year. People and professionals do need these things often with as much beans as they can afford and as small packages they're willing to fit in it. Tune into our channel each Friday as we measure just how much they're pushing the envelope with each new tool. Thank you for watching.